Do you remember the question that you'd asked about ends justify means, and like, could you rob a bank and give to the poor? Well, people would answer that by given, you need rules for life. You know, it reminds me of, you ever heard of Jordan Peterson? You want to hear my Jordan Peterson impersonation?
Oh, no. You got 10 rules for life. And if it's an archetypical kind of structure that, well, you got to clean your room, bucko. Well, of course, it's 10 rules for ethical systems.
Kind of like a Kermit the Frog. Okay, so it's your rules that you would go to and to determine something like that. And we'll be surveying, you know, the different kinds of ethical theories that have different rules. But again, this comes back to the ethical starting points. And there might be even more fun, as the book says, your author here in the introduction. The question keeps going, because you might ask, well, why this, right? And again, there'll be kind of more fundamental, more general kind of rules or theory that would underlie that. But here are some examples of some people's ethical starting points. You might have deliberately hurting other people requires justification. Equals always ought to be treated equally. Agony is bad. Might doesn't make right. Free and informed requests prevent rights violations. So those are all good rules. But one of the things that I noticed, and I don't remember if I brought this up Tuesday, but in debate, or even in philosophy, people might stop there as far as kind of their inquiry or attempting to justify that. Why? Because it looks like that would be all things that we would agree with. So they want to get to the point where, oh yeah, I agree with that. I don't need to go any further. But it's interesting. There's a difference between you might agree with it, but from your worldview or your philosophy or ethical system, can you justify that? Do you see that's different? And people often don't go that further step. So it's like, it's fine if you agree with that, but you might not have any good reasons to. It just sounds nice. And it's kind of when you hear that, in our minds, we kind of just stop there. It's like, well, yes, sounds right. Those are kind of rules that I implement. But philosophy's task is to go a little bit further, get down to the bottom and go, yeah, but why? I mean, what if I'm just psychologically preconditioned where that sounds good to me? You in philosophy, especially ethical philosophy, want to know the justifications for that. Are there good reasons to? And various theories will or will not be able to provide justifications for that. We have defining morality. Here you have a kind of a summarization of what was in the intro. What it is. Morality is focusing on the good life. Remember, we talked about our duties to others and the nature of virtue. So obviously in ethics, you want to avoid vice, doing bad things or acquiring bad traits, and you want to acquire virtues, good traits and characteristics. But you want to know what the nature of virtue is, and you also want to know what are our duties. Then it has what morality isn't. It isn't law. That's important. You might have a duty to law, but that's because that would be because of prior ethical commitment. So it's just making a distinction. It isn't etiquette. right? It's not social and table manners and stuff like that. It's not self-interest. It's not tradition, and it's not convention. Now, one thing that's interesting, this will probably come up in chapter 19. Called the is-ought distinction. It's not mentioned in chapter 19, but it'll end up relating to as we kind of flesh these issues out. So oftentimes in moral disputes or philosophical disagreements, somebody might say, yeah, but that person A thinks, let's just say position X, fill in blank. X is true. But person B thinks not X is true. So whatever moral position or philosophical position you could put in, it's just obviously the person B has the opposite view. Now, when we talk about morality, people often just say, well, that's what a person believes. And this person believes the other thing. That's to actually miss the point, because just grammatically, you're just giving what's called a description. Sort of like when people say, well, every person in a religion thinks their religion is right. And I was thinking about this the other day in the other class. I'm like, whoa, why wouldn't somebody even have to state that? Do you know anybody that's like, this is my position, and I believe sincerely it's entirely wrong? Truly. Like, everybody believes their position is right. So I don't know why that needs to be stated. That's simply a description. In philosophy, you don't want to know the psychology of somebody. It's like, of course, psychologically speaking, they think that their position is correct. You want to know the real state of affairs. Is it? Now, the difference with ethics is you're not looking for a description of what people believe or how they behave. You're not describing a state of affairs. Ethics is in this realm. So if they think that, I don't know, give me a moral. This person thinks slavery is natural and good, and this person doesn't. That would be, you're not asking the question, is that what the person believes? Ought they to believe that? That's the prescription. Should they? It's like when, think about if your parents, when you were a kid, says you should pick up your room. They're not describing a state of affairs. They're prescribing something. You need to do this, and if you don't do it, you're bad, right? And if you do, you're good. So the notion of good or bad is what's called values. And that's in this domain here. How they ought to act, things that they ought to believe. So I find that interesting and helpful because And this usually is a position of relativism. There is, it's just all perspective, right? Everybody believes their position is right. And well, one thing that you could object to is you're making a category mistake. You're describing, we're talking about ethics. Ought they to do that? Ought they to believe that? How should one act? Questions about that? Now, we'll go through, as we go through the book, you'll notice that the author structures things in arguments. Arguments are not shouting matches in philosophy. They're not bad things. They're good things. And just simply speaking, an argument is giving reasons for you to believe something. You have a good reason or a bad reason. Good argument, bad argument. Reasons for a conclusion. In the book, it states a chain of thought in which reasons, we call those premises, are offered in support of a particular conclusion. So you might have, that's called a premise. So if you have a statement that's offering to be support for another statement, then you call that in philosophy a premise. You may have multiple premises. These support a conclusion or attempt to. And then we'll see, given the way that you structure an argument, you can actually determine if it's a good argument. That's where it comes in the intro, where it talks about validity. And validity is actually, if you think about it like a formula, if a formula is good, then i.e. the structure of like your terms and stuff, if you just think mathematically, that means if I, like a function, for example, if I plug in the right stuff, I get the right stuff out. Well, arguments are like that in logic too. And what a valid argument is, it states if the premises are true, they don't have to be, but the structure is such that if those are actually true, then the conclusion must necessarily be true. What does it necessarily mean? Impossible to be false. It follows from necessity. And the book doesn't get too far into it, but for example, you can have things like all A is B, all B is C, therefore all A is C. All dogs are animals. All animals are, let's see, give me a.
Have legs.
A what?
Have legs.
Have legs, maybe? Do they?
Are living.
Yeah, you could do that. Are living, therefore dogs are living. All human beings and you can have it also like this. All human beings are rational you're rational, therefore you're a human being, right? So the way that these are structured, these terms, determines actually if it's valid. And there's kind of tests basically to test if an argument's actually valid. If you look, I don't know if you guys have your book, but in the introduction, on page So what becomes tricky about validity is you might actually have an argument. Let's see if it gives something. And the premises are actually true and the conclusion is true. But it's not valid. So the way that you think about that is, remember, a valid is if the premises are true, that conclusion has to be true. So one way to think about is what an invalid would be, where that same structure, where the same term, like, can you think about a premises that would actually, could it be the premises to be true and the conclusion false? If you can consider that, then you know that's not a good argument. It just happens to be the premises are true right here. But it could be that this is false. So here, the example is heroin is a drug. That's obviously true. Selling heroin is illegal. Unless you live in Portland now, right? Have you heard the joke about Portland? Anybody from Portland? I want to offend. So the joke is drugs are now decriminalized, but straws are illegal. And so this has created a conundrum for drug users because now they can't actually get the utensils and paraphernalia to make use of their drugs. The conclusion, therefore, heroin use is immoral. That may be, but it doesn't follow from these. So it's an invalid argument. Let's see if it gives. Here's a simple test down at the bottom of page 11. Identify all the argument's premises. We just did. Imagine all of them are true. And ask yourself this question: supposing that all the premises are true, could the conclusion be false? Yeah, it could be. But valid arguments don't allow for could be's. It has to be necessarily. So that's one way. Here's another one. Suppose you're a bit shaky on US history. And I'm trying to convince you John Quincy Adams was the 9th president of the United States. I offer you the following line of reasoning. John Quincy Adams was either the 8th or the 9th president. John Quincy Adams was not the 8th US president. Therefore, John Quincy Adams was the 9th US president. Now, here we have something a little bit different. The argument's actually good. The conclusion's false. Well, how is that possible? The conclusion for valid arguments, so this could be valid, just state if these are true, this would be true. However, which one is actually false? The first premise, John Quincy Adams was either the 8th or the 9th US president. That's not true. So you could still have a valid argument with false premises and a false or true conclusion. Does everybody get that? And what that's called, so let me just make a qualification here. What happens then when the structure of the argument is good, it's valid? So the structure of that argument was good, it just happened to be you had a false premise. What happens when you have a good structure, a valid argument, and all true premises? Then it's called sound. So this is kind of different distinctions that you got when we're going through the class. They'll present arguments, and you've got to kind of think through this. And what's difficult is oftentimes something might sound common sense or might sound like a good argument. But you have to actually think through, yeah, but does the conclusion, even if I agree with that, for example, he gives a conclusion in here that he presented an argument that eating meat is morally acceptable. I agree with that. But the problem was the argument that was offered was not a good argument. The reasons that were given doesn't actually support necessarily so you need to come up with a good argument. Now that's tricky because perhaps when you read that argument about the moral permissibility of eating animals, that you were like, yeah, that sounds good. Why? Because maybe you agree with the conclusion. Maybe you haven't actually thought through the actual structure of the argument. So that's why we need to know what an argument is, what makes an argument valid. But validity is not enough because then you got to look, yeah, but are the premises true? So in the meat eaters argument, if you call it that, the premises weren't true. Like one of them wasn't. If you remember that, do you remember what it was? I'll try to pop it up and see real quick. It's on page 14. If it's morally acceptable for non-human animals to kill and eat one another, then it's morally acceptable for humans to kill and eat non-human animals. 2, it's morally acceptable for non-human animals to kill and eat one another. So 2 is definitely true. The problem is premise 1. And then he goes into, well, the problem is because you don't think about, nobody calls animals moral agents. So there's an equivocation there that you are moral agents. Why? Why don't you put animals in like doggy jail for peeing on the floor, right? And one more thing. No, I mean, why don't we think of animals as moral agents than we do for human beings? So just apart from the meat. I remember it. And you were correct on what you. Hold on a second. I forgot to give you. I don't want to cheat you out of your points. Everybody that spoke, give me your last name in an orderly fashion. Last name. With a N. I'm going to ask for the letter because it's hard to hear through the mask. Who else spoke? Yes, you did speak. Last name? With a. Okay. It is hard to hear through the mask, huh? Or you were going to. Well, you don't get it until you actually do the. Yeah, go ahead. So.
I remember reading last night, it was talking about animals don't have the freaking power like humans.
Well, that's kind of what
that is.
But there's another important aspect.
Well, here it says they can't control their behavior through moral reasoning, but humans can.
Good. So where does that word control make you think of? Animals have consciousness, they have awareness. Who said that? Good. All right, make sure I get let's go through the names, everybody that spoke and everybody that didn't. You still have a chance. We still have time. With a, what letter?
L.
Next. Who else today? You spoke?
Miller.
Who else?
Apple. H.
And did I get you?
I was going to speak.
No, you're your next door neighbor.
All the way down.
And what was, sorry, last name, go ahead.
Egan.
Okay. Choice. Animals operate by instinct. They don't have the kind of freedom. Notice this is a principle in law too. That if somebody has diminished capacity as far as making a choice, they're not as legally culpable, right? Well, likewise in morality. In fact, Immanuel Kant says every ought implies a can. I mean, this is why if a rock rolls down and off something and smashes your car, are you like, I can't believe the moral vice of that rock? I mean, how shame on it. I'm just disgusted at the way that you grew up. You know, we tried to teach you, your mother and father didn't raise you to be, and look, I know that sometimes we can kind of speak that way with animals, but that's kind of an anthropomorphization, right? They can be conditioned as far as kind of pleasure and, with animals now, I guess it's better to actually condition them more with positive reinforcement rather than negative. You've got to be careful with not to traumatize the animal, but you get the idea. You don't actually hold them morally accountable because they don't have the same type of minds that you do with rationality and the ability to freely choose. And so you don't hold them morally accountable. Okay. Just go back to this. So that's the mistake of, you might have thought that was a great argument. Why? Because you like me. I do. But I had to kick in my philosophy and go, not so fast. Something's wrong with the support. I may agree with the conclusion and it may sound nice, but I need to go further and actually think, are one of those premises false? So even if the argument is valid, the structure is good. It's such that if I put in true stuff, I'd get necessarily true. What I identified is it's not sound because the first premise is simply not false. Is not true. It's false. Animals are not moral agents, and therefore you can't equate. We are moral agents, so you can't make an equivalence between us and animals just because they eat non-human beings doesn't mean that you can. You're going to need another argument, okay? So I like that. What else? That's it. And I would just summarize. Moral theory is a general principle or a set of principles that tells us what is morally right in a wide variety of cases. One of the central aims of moral philosophies, we know what we're doing, is to assess the plausibility of competing moral theories by using rational arguments. Isn't that just what we did? We're going to use those as the logic, as the tools, and assess, is it a good argument? What's your support? Why should I believe your moral theory over somebody else's? Any questions on that before we move on to, yes?
I was wondering if in this branch of philosophy, you also need to define your terms. I didn't know in my last philosophy class I had to do that. And one of the questions that's kind of disagreeing with the way he defined his terms. I disagree with the premise he put forth.
Yeah, that's a great, this comes up all the time in debate, and it's the same thing, debate and philosophy. And yet philosophers they'll slip up and not identify it. Just like when we had those starting points, we all probably agree with that. Sounds good. But we may not agree for the right reasons. So what was I thinking? I used this example in the other class. Let's take a non-controversial topic that we all agree on. You should wash your hands. Right? Is there anybody that wants to take the opposite position? Everybody should wash their hands, especially after using the toilet, right? Not controversial. I think we all agree. Now, if you ask me, why? And I'm like, well, because there's like invisible aliens that can get all over your hands. And when we wash them off, it actually helps the livestock population in Montana. It helps stabilize the livestock. You'd be like, that's not a reason to. Or let's say, give me another funny. Well, because that's what makes for a good stock market. It'll help Bitcoin go up. That's why. Why do you wash your hands? Well, obviously, because I'm invested in Bitcoin and I want to see the markets go. So notice you have to go to, no, just because we agree with something doesn't mean we agree for the same reasons. Now, with terms, we will think that we're agreeing to the same. I'm trying to think of an example. Maybe law or love, the word love. There was this Orthodox priest who was like from New York, so he had this funny accent. And his name was Father Thomas Hopko. And he had this kind of thing with like going into like, who's not for love? The Beatles said love, like, what's the song of the Beatles? All you need is love. But then when you get into it, what does that word mean? It might mean something entirely different given your ethical framework, your religion, your philosophy. So Father Thomas Hopko says, how love? Who love? What love? Like all these questions, he's like, those are big. And people just stay at the surface. Like, oh, everybody knows what that term means. And this comes up over and over in philosophy. Everybody knows what the term reality or being is. We'll use that as a starting point. Somebody brought this up the other day and we're like, hold on a second, that's the most disputed, convoluted term in all of philosophy, and everybody just knows what the word is means. Like, what? Being? So you're absolutely right. Don't let people get away with just thinking we agree or have the same, just because we're using the same word, that we mean the same things by it. So you need to, and that's part of philosophy, is most people live on the surface. They don't, as Socrates say, live the examined life. They don't question the things like, for example, we all believe we should wash our hands. They don't question why. We all use the same words. So we all know what this word means. Oh, really? Because when you start to go below the surface and ask further questions, you often find like, well, that's not actually you're absolutely right. That's not what I mean by it. So I think that's a valid criticism, and even philosophers mess up on. They just don't go and examine. They assume. You should never assume that we mean the same thing by that word. So clarify your terms. Did you want to say anything more about when you were thinking through that?
Go back to the question, I don't know the example. Like you were saying, you can't have moral disagreements and cultural.
Oh, this is chapter 19.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, he was basically saying, he was going over problems with relativism. And he's basically said, if you accept that position, then there is nothing that's objectively true. So what you're simply saying is all positions are true or equally valid. At that point, you forfeit, he says there's two ways you can go with that. Either you contradict yourself by holding that position, or you go the route of, well, I'm not trying to make a truth claim, I'm just giving a psychological report. This is how I feel. Well, at that point, he says that comes with the cost that, well, now there's no more moral disputes. We're just talking about feelings. Feelings are no more right or wrong than what? Than like a chair or something. Like we're just giving a report about. So he says it comes with a cost, is what I think that's what he was saying.
But couldn't you also see it as like, I'm stating my stance and then I'm going to have to defend it, like both sides are like, I'm against abortion, I'm for abortion. Like that's stating their opinion, sure, but then they can try to argue the point.
But then he says now that you're into the contradict, because now you're going to, what are you trying to argue? Because again, it's obvious that's what you believe, but you're trying to, if you argue, now you're moving into, it's not just my opinion, but you ought to believe it. Like it's actually true. So then it's called like two horns of a dilemma. Now you're contradicting yourself because relativism says there are no absolute objective truths. That's just your opinion, man. While I objectively believe that opinion is true. And I'm going to argue for it. So he's like, that's a contradiction. Or you can just be like, no, I'm going to go the other route and just say, this is what I believe. Well, at that point, you're just describing psychology. And because your position is that everybody's position is equally valid, there's nothing to actually argue. There's no moral dispute. You're just like reporting feelings. I think that's what he's saying. Thanks.